Alexander Stewart could not stop smiling. That was the first thing Nathan Bailey noticed when his best friend walked into their shared apartment that evening. His face lit up with a grin so wide and genuine that it made Nathan's heart skip in a way that terrified him. Alexander had been acting strange for weeks now, different in ways that Nathan couldn't quite put his finger on. And seeing him this happy should have been a relief. Instead, it sent a knife of jealousy twisting through Nathan's chest because he knew with absolute certainty that whatever was making Alexander smile like that had nothing to do with him. Nathan had been in love with his best friend for 2 years and 4 months. He had counted every day since the moment he realized that the ache in his chest whenever Alexander talked about dating someone new wasn't just protective friendship, but something deeper. Something that made him feel like he was drowning in plain sight. He had become an expert at hiding it, at being the supportive friend who listened to Alexander's relationship troubles and offered advice that felt like swallowing glass. But this smile was different. This smile looked like someone who had finally found what they were looking for. Alexander kicked off his shoes and flopped onto their couch, that brilliant smile never leaving his face. He ran his hands through his dark hair and let out a laugh that sounded like pure joy. Nathan watched from the kitchen doorway, gripping his coffee mug so tightly his knuckles went white, waiting for the inevitable confession about whatever girl had finally captured Alexander's heart completely. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, how Nathan had spent over 2 years loving someone who seemed perpetually just out of reach, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to when they were just roommates who had met through a housing app, two guys looking to split rent in an expensive city who had somehow become each other's most important person without either of them quite realizing when it had happened. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Nathan had been sitting in this same kitchen, watching Alexander pace back and forth while complaining about his latest relationship disaster. Alexander had been dating Jessica Robinson for 6 weeks, and Nathan had listened to every detail of their courtship with the kind of masochistic dedication that only someone hopelessly in love could manage. "I just don't get it," Alexander had said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "She's beautiful, she's smart, she's funny. On paper, she's perfect. But when we're together, it feels like I'm playing a role in a movie I never auditioned for." Nathan had nodded and made sympathetic noises, while internally cataloging this as yet another sign that Alexander was simply impossible to please when it came to relationships. It was a pattern Nathan had observed for the entire time they had known each other. Alexander would meet someone, be initially excited, and then gradually become distant and dissatisfied in ways he could never quite articulate. "What do you mean playing a role?" Nathan had asked, because that was what a good friend would do. A good friend would help Alexander work through his relationship issues, even if every word felt like swallowing broken glass. Alexander had stopped pacing and looked at Nathan with an expression that was half confusion, half desperation. "It's like when we kiss, I'm thinking about whether I'm doing it right instead of just feeling it. When she tells me she loves me, I say it back because that's what you're supposed to do, but the words feel empty, like I'm reading from a script someone else wrote." Nathan had felt something dangerous flutter in his chest at those words, something that felt suspiciously like hope. But he had pushed it down because hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he had suggested that maybe Alexander just needed more time, that sometimes real feelings took a while to develop. Alexander had given him a look that was grateful and sad at the same time. "You always know what to say," he had said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." And Nathan had smiled and changed the subject because what else could he do? He couldn't very well say that the reason Alexander felt like he was playing a role with Jessica was because he was, that the reason nothing felt real was because he was looking for something he hadn't found yet. He couldn't say that because Nathan was terrified that if Alexander ever did find what he was looking for, it would be with someone else entirely. The next few weeks had been torture. Alexander had tried harder with Jessica, taking her on elaborate dates and buying her thoughtful gifts. But the more effort he put in, the more hollow it seemed to make him feel. Nathan had watched his best friend slowly disappear into a version of himself that felt like a performance, and it had been almost worse than watching him be happy with someone else. The breaking point had come on a Tuesday night in late October. Alexander had come home from a dinner date with Jessica looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with being physically tired. He had sat down heavily on their couch and stared at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking. "I think I'm broken," he had said quietly. Nathan had looked up from his laptop where he had been pretending to work while actually waiting for Alexander to come home. "What do you mean?" I think there's something fundamentally wrong with me," Alexander had continued. "Jessica is amazing. Any guy would be lucky to have her. But when she talks about our future together, about moving in together and meeting each other's families, I feel like I'm suffocating. Not because of her specifically, but because the whole thing feels like I'm trying to fit into a shape that wasn't made for me." Nathan had closed his laptop and given Alexander his full attention, even though every instinct told him to flee from this conversation. "What kind of shape do you think was made for you?" Alexander had been quiet for so long that Nathan thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he had turned to look at Nathan directly, and there had been something vulnerable and searching in his expression that made Nathan's breath catch. "I don't know," Alexander had said, "but I know it's not this." They had broken up 3 days later. Alexander had been sad but also relieved in a way that had been obvious to everyone except Jessica, who had been blindsided by the sudden end of what she had thought was a promising relationship. Nathan had felt terrible for her and guilty about the relief that had flooded through him when Alexander had told him it was over. But the relief had been short-lived because Alexander hadn't bounced back the way he usually did after a breakup. Instead, he had become introspective and quiet, spending long hours staring out their living room window like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have all its pieces. It was during one of these contemplative periods that Alexander had asked the question that had changed everything. They had been sitting on opposite ends of their couch, watching some mindless action movie that neither of them was really paying attention to. Alexander had been unusually fidgety all evening, playing with the hem of his shirt and shifting positions every few minutes like he couldn't get comfortable. "Can I ask you something weird?" he had said suddenly, his voice cutting through the movie's explosions and gunfire. Nathan had muted the television and turned to face him. "Sure. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to kiss another guy?" The question had hit Nathan like a physical blow. He had spent so much time imagining exactly that scenario, specifically with Alexander, that for a moment he was sure his thoughts were written across his face in neon letters. But Alexander had been looking at him with genuine curiosity, not suspicion, so Nathan had managed to keep his voice steady when he answered. "I think most people have wondered about it at some point," he had said carefully. "We are." Alexander had been quiet for a moment, his fingers still playing with his shirt hem. "I was talking to Christopher Wright at work today. You know, the guy from accounting who's married to Anthony Reyes? And he was telling me about how he knew he was gay because kissing girls always felt like he was going through the motions. But the first time he kissed a guy, it felt like coming home." Nathan's heart had started beating so fast he was sure Alexander could hear it. "What about it?" "I just keep thinking about what he said," Alexander had continued, "about kissing, feeling like coming home. Because I've kissed a lot of girls, and none of them have ever felt like that. They felt nice or exciting or whatever, but never like something I'd been missing my whole life." Nathan had been afraid to breathe, afraid to move, afraid to do anything that might break the spell of this conversation. "Do you think you might want to try kissing a guy?" Alexander had looked at him then, really looked at him, and Nathan had seen something in his eyes that made his stomach flip. "Maybe," Alexander had said quietly. "Would that be weird?" "No," Nathan had managed to say. It wouldn't be weird at all. But Alexander hadn't kissed him that night. Instead, he had nodded thoughtfully and turned the movie back on, leaving Nathan to spend the rest of the evening in a state of hyper-awareness, cataloging every glance and gesture for signs of what Alexander might be thinking. The weeks that followed had been a special kind of torture. Alexander had started asking more questions, casual inquiries about Nathan's dating history, and his thoughts on sexuality that felt loaded with meaning Nathan was afraid to interpret. They had started sitting closer together on the couch during their movie nights, their shoulders touching in a way that sent electricity shooting through Nathan's entire body. Alexander had begun initiating physical contact more frequently, brief touches on Nathan's arm during conversation, or hands that lingered when passing objects between them. Nathan had been afraid to read too much into any of it, because the alternative, that Alexander was just going through a phase of curiosity that would eventually pass, was too painful to consider. So he had tried to be supportive without being pushy, answering Alexander's questions honestly, while being careful not to reveal the depth of his own feelings. The shift had been gradual but unmistakable. Alexander had started looking at Nathan differently, his gaze lingering on Nathan's face during conversations in a way that made Nathan feel exposed and hopeful in equal measure. He had started asking Nathan's opinion on things that seemed increasingly personal, like what Nathan thought made a good relationship or what he looked for in a partner. One evening in early December, they had been cooking dinner together when Alexander had suddenly stopped chopping vegetables and turned to Nathan with an expression of intense concentration. "Can I tell you something?" he had said, and Nathan had nodded even though his heart was racing. "I've been thinking a lot about what makes me happy," Alexander had continued. "Like really happy, not just content or satisfied. And I realized that all my happiest memories involve you." Nathan had nearly dropped the pot he was holding. "What do you mean?" "I mean, like that time we got snowed in last winter and spent 3 days playing board games and talking about everything and nothing. Or when we drove to the coast last summer and you made me pull over every 5 minutes to take pictures of things you thought were beautiful. Or even just regular nights like this, when we're cooking together and everything feels easy and right." Nathan had been afraid to speak, afraid that his voice would give away everything he had been trying to hide. "I keep trying to figure out why none of my relationships have worked," Alexander had continued, moving closer to Nathan in the small kitchen space. "And I think it's because I've been looking for something I already have." Nathan had turned to face him fully then, the cooking completely forgotten. "What are you saying?" Alexander had reached out and touched Nathan's arm, his fingers warm against Nathan's skin. "I'm saying that I think I've been an idiot. I'm saying that I think the reason nothing has ever felt right with anyone else is because my heart was already taken and I was too stupid to realize it." The kitchen had felt too small suddenly, the air between them charged with 2 years' worth of unspoken feelings. Nathan had searched Alexander's face for any sign that he was misunderstanding, but all he saw was sincerity and something that looked like love. "Alexander," Nathan had whispered, and it had sounded like a prayer. "I know this is crazy," Alexander had said, his hands sliding down to catch Nathan's fingers. "I know we're best friends, and this could ruin everything. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship." Nathan had felt like the world had tilted on its axis, like everything he thought he knew about his life had suddenly rearranged itself into a completely different picture. "You feel something for me?" "I feel everything for you," Alexander had said simply. "I think I have for a long time, but I was too scared to admit it to myself because it meant accepting that everything I thought I knew about who I was might be wrong." Nathan had stared at him for a long moment, hardly daring to believe that this conversation was really happening. "And now I think maybe I was wrong about who I was, but I was right about what I wanted," Alexander had said. "I just didn't understand that what I wanted was you." The confession had hung between them like a bridge. Neither was ready to cross. Nathan had felt 2 years' worth of careful control crumbling, all the walls he had built to protect his heart from hoping too much suddenly useless. "I've been in love with you for over 2 years," Nathan had said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I've been dying a little bit every day, watching you with other people and knowing I could never tell you how I felt." Alexander's eyes had widened, and then his face had broken into that same brilliant smile Nathan had seen earlier, the one that had started this whole evening of revelation. "2 years?" Alexander had asked, stepping even closer. "2 years and 4 months," Nathan had confirmed. "Not that I was counting." Alexander had laughed then, a sound of pure joy that filled their small kitchen. "God, we're idiots," he had said. "We could have been doing this for 2 years." "Doing what?" Nathan had asked, even though he thought he knew. "This," Alexander had said, and then he had cupped Nathan's face in his hands and kissed him. The kiss had been everything Nathan had imagined, and nothing like he had expected. It had been soft at first, tentative, like Alexander was asking a question. But when Nathan had kissed him back, when Nathan had let himself finally respond to the longing that had been eating him alive for over 2 years, Alexander had made a small sound of surprise and relief and deepened the kiss. It had felt like coming home. It had felt like every cliche Nathan had ever rolled his eyes at, like finding a missing piece of himself he hadn't even known was lost. Alexander's hands had been warm against his face, his mouth soft and sure. And Nathan had thought dimly that this was what Christopher Wright had been talking about, this sense of rightness that made everything else feel like a pale imitation. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing heavily, Alexander had rested his forehead against Nathan's and smiled. "Wow," he had whispered. "Yeah," Nathan had managed to say. "Wow." They had stood there for a moment, foreheads touching, both of them grinning like idiots. Then Alexander had started laughing, and Nathan had joined in. And suddenly they were both laughing so hard they had to hold on to each other to stay upright. "I can't believe we waited this long," Alexander had said when they finally caught their breath. "I can't believe you figured it out," Nathan had replied. "I was starting to think I was going to love you in secret forever." Alexander had grown serious then, his hands sliding down to rest on Nathan's shoulders. "Never in secret," he had said. "Not anymore. I want everyone to know how I feel about you." And Nathan had kissed him again, because what else could he do when the person he loved was saying everything he had dreamed of hearing for over 2 years? But of course, it hadn't been that simple. Nothing ever was when feelings that had been hidden for so long suddenly came into the light. They had spent the rest of that evening talking, really talking about everything they had been too afraid to say before. Alexander had told Nathan about the growing realization that his dissatisfaction with every relationship had been because he was comparing them to what he had with Nathan. Nathan had confessed about the agony of giving relationship advice while being secretly in love, about the nights he had lain awake wondering what it would feel like to be the person Alexander came home to instead of the friend Alexander complained to. They had been careful with each other in those first few days, both of them aware that they were navigating uncharted territory. Alexander had been patient with Nathan's moments of disbelief, the times when Nathan would look at him and seem surprised to find that this was real, that Alexander really did love him back. Nathan had been understanding when Alexander had moments of panic about what this meant for his understanding of himself, about how to explain this change to friends and family who had only ever known him to date women. The first time Alexander had introduced Nathan as his boyfriend, instead of his roommate, had been to Dennis Bennett, a colleague who had stopped by their apartment to drop off some work documents. Nathan had been in the kitchen making coffee when he heard Alexander say, "Dennis, I'd like you to meet my boyfriend Nathan," and he had nearly dropped the entire pot. Later, after Dennis had left with a slightly stunned expression but genuine congratulations, Nathan had found Alexander sitting on their couch looking dazed. "You okay?" Nathan had asked, settling down beside him. "I just told someone you were my boyfriend," Alexander had said wonderingly, out loud, and it felt completely natural. "How do you feel about that?" Nathan had asked, because he was still learning to believe that this was real, that Alexander wasn't going to wake up one day and decide this had all been a mistake. Alexander had turned to look at him, and his expression had been so full of love and certainty that Nathan had felt something tight in his chest finally relax. "I feel like I finally know who I am," Alexander had said, "and who I am is someone who loves you." The transition from best friends to boyfriends had been surprisingly smooth in some ways, and surprisingly complicated in others. The physical intimacy had felt natural from the very beginning, like they had been waiting their whole lives to touch each other this way. Alexander had been fascinated by every new discovery, the way Nathan's breath caught when Alexander kissed the spot just below his ear, the way Nathan's hands felt tangled in Alexander's hair, the way they fit together when they fell asleep curled around each other. But there had been moments of adjustment too. Alexander had needed time to process what this meant about his sexuality, to reconcile the person he had thought he was with the person he was discovering himself to be. He had spent hours researching and reading, trying to understand his own experience and put words to feelings that were new and overwhelming. "I don't think I'm gay," he had told Nathan one evening as they lay in bed together, Nathan's head on Alexander's chest. "I think I might be bisexual, or maybe demisexual, or maybe I just don't care about labels as long as I get to be with you." "You don't have to figure it all out right now," Nathan had said, pressing a kiss to Alexander's collarbone. "You have time to understand yourself." But Alexander had been determined to understand, to make sense of his own story in a way that honored both who he had been and who he was becoming. He had started seeing a therapist who specialized in sexuality and identity, not because he thought there was anything wrong with him, but because he wanted to process this change in a healthy way. The therapist had helped him understand that sexuality could be fluid, that it was okay that he had been genuinely attracted to women in the past, even though his deepest feelings were for Nathan. She had helped him see that his previous relationships hadn't failed because he was broken, but because he had been trying to force himself into a mold that didn't quite fit. I think I fell in love with you as a person before I understood that I could fall in love with you as a man, Alexander had explained to Nathan after one of his therapy sessions. Like, I knew I loved you, but I didn't have a framework for understanding that it was romantic love until I started questioning everything else about my relationships. Nathan had been amazed by Alexander's commitment to understanding himself, by his willingness to do the hard work of self-examination and growth. It had made Nathan love him even more, if that was possible. They had been together for 3 weeks when Alexander had brought up the subject of telling their families. They had been having breakfast on a Saturday morning, both of them still in pajamas, when Alexander had suddenly gotten quiet. My mom called yesterday, he had said, not looking up from his cereal. She asked about Jessica, and I told her we broke up. Then she asked if I was seeing anyone new, and I didn't know what to say. Nathan had felt his stomach clench with anxiety. What do you want to say? I want to tell her about you, Alexander had said, finally meeting Nathan's eyes. I want to tell her that I'm happier than I've ever been and that it's because of you. But I'm scared she won't understand. Nathan had reached across the table and taken Alexander's hand. We don't have to tell anyone until you're ready. There's no rush. But Alexander had shaken his head. I am ready. I mean, I'm terrified, but I'm ready. I don't want to hide this. I don't want to hide you. So they had made the calls together, Alexander to his parents and Nathan to his. Both sets of parents had been surprised but ultimately supportive, more concerned with their son's happiness than with the gender of their partners. Alexander's mother had cried, but they had been tears of relief that Alexander finally seemed settled and content in a way she had never seen before. Your happiness is what matters, she had told him over speakerphone while Nathan listened from across the room. And if Nathan makes you happy, then I love him already. Nathan's parents had been characteristically practical, asking questions about their living situation and their plans for the future with the same matter-of-fact approach they brought to everything else. His father had made a joke about finally understanding why Nathan had never brought home any girlfriends he seemed serious about, and his mother had immediately started planning a dinner to welcome Alexander to the family officially. The first time they had said I love you had been 3 weeks after their first kiss, on a quiet Sunday morning when they were both still half asleep. Nathan had woken up first, as he usually did, and had spent several minutes just watching Alexander sleep. Alexander's face was peaceful and young-looking in the morning light, his hair sticking up in directions that defied gravity, and Nathan had felt such a wave of tenderness that it had taken his breath away. I love you, he had whispered, not really meaning for Alexander to hear. But Alexander's eyes had fluttered open, and he had smiled that sleepy, contented smile that Nathan was quickly becoming addicted to. I love you too, Alexander had murmured, his voice rough with sleep. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. Nathan had kissed him then, soft and slow and sweet, and they had spent the rest of the morning in bed talking about everything and nothing, mapping the new territory of being in love and being loved in return. But even with all the joy and discovery, there had been challenges. Alexander had struggled with moments of doubt, not about his feelings for Nathan, but about his own identity and what this meant for his future. He had worried about disappointing people, about being seen as confused or going through a phase, about whether he was being fair to Nathan by figuring himself out in the middle of a relationship. Nathan had his own moments of insecurity, times when he wondered if Alexander would eventually miss being with women, if this was really sustainable long-term, or just an intense friendship that had gotten confused with romance. He had struggled with feeling like he was asking Alexander to give up too much, to change too much of his understanding of himself. They had worked through these doubts together, talking through every fear and insecurity with the kind of honest communication that Nathan had never experienced in any relationship before. Alexander had been patient with Nathan's moments of panic, reassuring him over and over that this wasn't a phase or an experiment, that what he felt was real and lasting and true. I'm not giving anything up, Alexander had told him during one particularly difficult conversation. I'm finally allowing myself to have what I actually want instead of what I thought I was supposed to want. And Nathan had been patient with Alexander's process of self-discovery, understanding that coming to terms with a new understanding of his sexuality was a journey that couldn't be rushed or simplified. You're not disappointing anyone who matters, Nathan had assured him, and anyone who can't accept your happiness isn't worth worrying about. Gradually, they had found their rhythm. Alexander had stopped second-guessing every feeling and started trusting his own experience. Nathan had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop and started believing that this was real, that Alexander really did choose him every day. They had developed routines and inside jokes and ways of being together that felt as natural as breathing. Alexander had started leaving little notes in Nathan's lunch bag, silly drawings and declarations of love that made Nathan smile in the middle of difficult workdays. Nathan had learned that Alexander liked to be the little spoon even though he was taller, and that he made soft humming sounds when he was completely content. They had navigated their first fight, a stupid argument about whose turn it was to do laundry that had escalated into a larger discussion about household responsibilities and communication. They had both said things they regretted, both stormed off to separate rooms, both spent an hour being stubborn before realizing that being right wasn't worth being apart. The makeup had been sweet and thorough, full of apologies and promises to do better, and it had taught them both that they could disagree without the relationship falling apart, that they could work through problems instead of avoiding them. 3 months into their relationship, they had faced their first real external challenge when Alexander's ex-girlfriend Jessica had reached out, wanting to meet for coffee to get closure on their relationship. Alexander had been torn between wanting to be kind to someone he had cared about and not wanting to do anything that might hurt Nathan or their relationship. They had talked it through extensively, and Nathan had ultimately encouraged Alexander to meet with Jessica, understanding that Alexander needed to handle this situation with honesty and compassion. The coffee meeting had been awkward but necessary. Jessica had been hurt and confused, unable to understand how Alexander could go from being in a relationship with her to being in a relationship with a man so quickly. Alexander had tried to explain without going into too much detail about his own journey of self-discovery. It's not that there was anything wrong with you or our relationship, he had told her. It's that I wasn't being honest with myself about what I really wanted, and that wasn't fair to either of us. Jessica had been upset, but she had also been perceptive enough to see that Alexander was happier and more authentic than she had ever seen him. Eventually, she had wished him well, though it had taken her some time to fully accept the situation. The experience had been difficult for Alexander, bringing up feelings of guilt and regret about the way his previous relationships had ended. But it had also been clarifying, helping him understand that he couldn't change the past, only learn from it and do better going forward. I hurt people by not being honest with myself, he had told Nathan afterward. I don't want to do that anymore. I want to live authentically, even when it's scary. Nathan had been proud of Alexander for handling the situation with such maturity and grace, and it had deepened his respect for the man he loved. As winter turned to spring, their relationship had deepened and stabilized. They had moved from the giddy excitement of new love to something more sustainable and profound. They had learned each other's rhythms and preferences, had figured out how to support each other through stress and celebrate each other's successes. Alexander had excelled in a major project at work, earning a promotion that he had been working toward for months. Nathan had been there to celebrate with him, taking him out to dinner at their favorite restaurant and listening to him talk excitedly about his new responsibilities. Nathan had struggled through a difficult period when his grandmother had been hospitalized, and Alexander had been a constant source of comfort and support, driving Nathan to the hospital every day and holding him when he cried. They had taken their first trip together, a long weekend at a cabin in the mountains where they had hiked and read and spent long hours talking about their future together. It had been perfect in the way that simple pleasures often are, unmarked by drama or conflict, just two people who loved each other, enjoying being together. On the last night of the trip, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset, Alexander had taken Nathan's hand and said something that had made Nathan's heart skip. I want to do this for the rest of my life, Alexander had said quietly. I want to take trips with you and come home to you and build a life that's ours together. Nathan had squeezed his hand and smiled. What does that look like to you? Alexander had been quiet for a moment, thinking. I don't know all the details yet, but I know I want us to be a team in everything. I want to support your dreams and have you support mine. I want to adopt a dog together and argue about what to name it. I want to host dinner parties where we cook together and embarrass each other with stories about how we fell in love. I want to grow old with you and still be holding your hand on a porch somewhere when we're 80. Nathan had felt tears prick his eyes at the simple sincerity of Alexander's words. That sounds perfect to me. 6 months into their relationship, they had made the decision to move to a bigger apartment together, one that felt like theirs rather than a space they happened to share. The apartment hunting had been an adventure in itself, full of disagreements about priorities and budget and location that had tested their ability to compromise and communicate. Nathan had wanted something close to public transportation with lots of natural light. Alexander had prioritized having a good kitchen and enough space for a home office. They had looked at dozens of places, each finding something wrong with the other's favorites, until they had finally found a place that checked most of both their boxes. The moving process had been exhausting and stressful, but it had also been fun in the way that shared challenges could be when you were facing them with someone you loved. They had packed and unpacked together, had argued about where to put furniture and how to organize their combined possessions, had collapsed on their new couch at the end of moving day feeling accomplished and happy. Their first night in the new apartment, they had ordered takeout and eaten it sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes, making plans for how to decorate and organize their space. It feels like ours, Alexander had said, looking around at their new living room. Like we chose it together and we're building something together. Nathan had agreed, feeling a sense of permanence and commitment that was both thrilling and comforting. They were no longer just roommates who had fallen in love. They were partners building a life together. The new apartment had given them space to grow into their relationship in new ways. Alexander had set up a small art studio in the spare bedroom, returning to the painting hobby he had abandoned years earlier. Nathan had created a reading nook by the big window in the living room, a space where he could curl up with books on weekend mornings while Alexander cooked breakfast. They had hosted their first dinner party in the new place, inviting Christopher Wright and Anthony Reyes, the couple whose story had helped Alexander understand his own feelings. It had been nerve-wracking and wonderful, playing host together and introducing Alexander as Nathan's boyfriend to people who mattered to them. Christopher had pulled Nathan aside during the evening to tell him how happy Alexander seemed, how different he was from the confused and restless person Christopher had talked to at work months earlier. "You're good for him," Christopher had said, "but more than that, you two are good together. You can see how much you love each other just by watching you interact." Nathan had felt a warm glow of pride and satisfaction at those words, knowing that what they had built together was visible to others, that their love was something real and lasting and worth celebrating. As their first year together approached, Nathan had started thinking about the future in concrete terms. He had begun saving money for an engagement ring, though he wasn't sure when or how he wanted to propose. He had started imagining their life 5 years, 10 years down the line, and every vision included Alexander. Alexander had been thinking about the future too, bringing up conversations about marriage and children and long-term goals with increasing frequency. They had talked about wanting to travel together, about the possibility of buying a house someday, about how they wanted to balance their individual ambitions with their shared life. "I never used to be able to picture my future clearly," Alexander had told Nathan one evening as they cooked dinner together in their new kitchen. "I had vague ideas about career success and maybe getting married someday, but it all felt hypothetical. Now I can see it so clearly, and you're in every part of it." Nathan had smiled and kissed Alexander's cheek. "Where do you see us in 5 years?" Alexander had paused in his chopping of vegetables and really considered the question. "In 5 years, I see us in a house with a yard where we can have that dog we keep talking about. I see us hosting holidays for our families, being the couple that everyone knows is solid and happy. I see us supporting each other through career changes and challenges, being each other's safe place when the world gets crazy." Nathan had felt his heart swell with love and certainty. "That sounds perfect to me." "And what about you?" Alexander had asked. "Where do you see us?" Nathan had thought about all the ways his life had changed since falling in love with Alexander, all the ways he had grown and become more himself. "I see us being partners in everything. I see us traveling and having adventures, but always coming home to each other. I see us being old and still laughing together, still choosing each other every day. They had finished cooking in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the future they were building together. Later that night, as they lay in bed with Alexander's head on Nathan's chest, Alexander had said something that had surprised Nathan with its vulnerability. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real," Alexander had whispered. "Sometimes I wake up and I'm amazed that I get to love you and be loved by you." Nathan had run his fingers through Alexander's hair and smiled in the darkness. "I know exactly what you mean. I spent so long thinking this was impossible that sometimes it still feels like a dream. But it's not a dream," Alexander had said, pressing a kiss to Nathan's chest. "This is real and it's ours, and I'm never going to take it for granted." Nathan had held him closer, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude for the strange and wonderful series of events that had led them to this moment. 2 years ago, he had been convinced that loving Alexander was a burden he would carry in silence forever. Now Alexander was here in his arms, planning their future together and promising never to take their love for granted. As they approached their first anniversary, Nathan had finally worked up the courage to start shopping for engagement rings. He had enlisted the help of Patricia Gomez, Alexander's sister, who had been thrilled to be included in the planning process. "He's going to cry," Patricia had warned Nathan as they looked at rings together. "He cries at commercials now when they show happy couples. You proposing is going to destroy him in the best possible way." Nathan had laughed, knowing she was right. Alexander had become more emotionally open since they had gotten together, more willing to show his feelings and be vulnerable. It was one of the things Nathan loved most about their relationship, the way they had both become more themselves by being together. The ring Nathan had chosen was simple and elegant, a white gold band with a small diamond that caught the light beautifully. It was classic and timeless, like the love he felt for Alexander, and he could picture it on Alexander's hand for the rest of their lives. He had planned to propose on their anniversary, which fell on a Saturday in early December, exactly 1 year after their first kiss in the kitchen. But life had other plans. 3 weeks before their anniversary, Alexander had come home from work with that brilliant smile that had started this whole story. The smile that had made Nathan's heart skip and his stomach clench with jealousy before he understood what it meant. But now Nathan knew what that smile meant. Now he understood that Alexander smiled like that when he was planning something special, when he had a secret that he was excited to share. Nathan had seen that smile when Alexander had been planning Nathan's birthday surprise, and when he had been secretly arranging for Nathan's parents to visit for Thanksgiving. So when Alexander had walked into their apartment that evening with that particular smile, Nathan had felt excitement rather than jealousy, curiosity rather than fear. He had watched Alexander kick off his shoes and flop onto their couch, that brilliant smile never leaving his face, and had waited for Alexander to share whatever was making him so happy. "I have something to tell you," Alexander had said, patting the couch next to him in invitation. Nathan had joined him, settling close enough that their knees touched, and had waited with anticipation for Alexander's news. "I've been planning something," Alexander had begun, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Something for our anniversary. But I don't think I can wait 3 more weeks to tell you about it." Nathan had felt his heart start to race, wondering if Alexander was thinking along the same lines he was, if they were both ready to take the next step in their relationship. "What have you been planning?" Nathan had asked, smiling at Alexander's obvious excitement. Alexander had reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Nathan had felt his world tilt on its axis for the second time since knowing Alexander. "I know we've only been together for a year," Alexander had said, his voice suddenly nervous despite his smile. "But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know that you're my person, my home, my everything. And I know that I don't want to wait any longer to ask you to marry me." Nathan had stared at the ring box in Alexander's hands, feeling like he was dreaming. This couldn't be happening. Alexander couldn't be proposing when Nathan had been planning to propose to him. "Nathan," Alexander had said, his voice uncertain now, "are you okay?" Nathan had started laughing then, the kind of helpless laughter that comes from situations too absurd and wonderful to process normally. He had laughed until tears streamed down his face, until Alexander had started looking genuinely worried. "I'm sorry," Nathan had managed to say between fits of laughter. "I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing because this is the most ridiculous, perfect thing that has ever happened to me." "What do you mean?" Alexander had asked, looking confused but starting to smile again at Nathan's obvious joy. Nathan had gotten up from the couch and walked to their bedroom, returning a moment later with his own small velvet box. Alexander's eyes had gone wide, and then he had started laughing too. "You have got to be kidding me," Alexander had said, looking between Nathan's ring box and his own. "Were we really both planning to propose?" Nathan had asked, sitting back down next to Alexander. "Apparently so," Alexander had said, shaking his head in amazement. "We are either the most romantic couple in the world or the most ridiculous." "Why not both?" Nathan had suggested, and they had both dissolved into laughter again. When they had finally composed themselves, they had looked at each other with expressions of pure love and joy and slight disbelief at the absurdity of the situation. "So what do we do now?" Alexander had asked. "Do we both propose? Do we flip a coin?" Nathan had considered this for a moment, then had an idea. "What if we do this together? What if we ask each other at the same time?" Alexander's face had lit up with delight. "That's perfect. That's exactly what we should do." So they had knelt facing each other on their living room floor, each holding their ring box, both grinning like idiots and trying not to laugh. "On three?" Alexander had suggested. "On three?" Nathan had agreed. They had counted together, 1, 2, 3, and then had spoken in unison. "Will you marry me?" The simultaneous proposals had dissolved them both into laughter again, but they had managed to exchange rings through their giggles, each slipping the band they had chosen onto the other's finger, with hands that shook slightly with emotion. The rings had been perfect, both simple and elegant in similar styles that showed how well they knew each other's tastes. Nathan had been amazed by how right it felt to see his ring on Alexander's hand, how complete it made everything feel. "I love you," Alexander had said when they had finally stopped laughing long enough to speak. "I love you so much, and I can't wait to be your husband." "I love you too," Nathan had replied, pulling Alexander into a kiss that tasted like joy and forever. "I can't wait to marry you." They had spent the rest of the evening calling their families and friends to share the news. Both sets of parents crying happy tears over the phone and demanding to know when the wedding would be. Patricia had shrieked so loudly that Alexander had had to hold the phone away from his ear, and Christopher and Anthony had insisted on coming over immediately to celebrate with champagne. The celebration had been perfect, full of laughter and love and friends who were genuinely happy for them. But Nathan's favorite moment had been later that night, after everyone had gone home, when he and Alexander had been getting ready for bed. Alexander had been brushing his teeth when he had suddenly stopped and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, holding up his left hand to look at his engagement ring. "I'm engaged," he had said around a mouthful of toothpaste, his voice full of wonder. "We're engaged," Nathan had corrected, coming up behind him and wrapping his arms around Alexander's waist. Alexander had leaned back against Nathan's chest and smiled at their reflection. "We're going to get married. We're going to get married," Nathan had agreed, pressing a kiss to Alexander's neck. And they had stood there for a moment, looking at themselves in the mirror. Two people who had found their way to each other despite all the odds, who had built something beautiful and lasting out of friendship and love and trust. 6 months later, they had gotten married in a small ceremony in Nathan's parents' backyard, surrounded by the people who mattered most to them. Alexander had cried during his vows, just as Patricia had predicted, and Nathan had cried too, overwhelmed by the reality of promising forever to the person he loved most in the world. Now, 2 years after that first smile that had started everything, Nathan watched his husband Alexander come home from work with that same brilliant expression, and he knew without asking what it meant. Alexander had gotten the promotion he had been hoping for, the one that would let them start thinking seriously about buying a house and maybe adopting that dog they kept talking about. But more than that, Alexander smiled like that because he was happy, genuinely and completely happy, in a way that had taken him years to find. He smiled like that because he had learned to be honest with himself about what he wanted, because he had found the courage to reach for it even when it scared him. And Nathan smiled back because he had learned that love didn't have to be a secret burden carried in silence, that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that caught you completely off guard, the ones that grew out of friendship and trust in the simple recognition that home wasn't a place but a person. Alexander kicked off his shoes and crossed the room to kiss Nathan hello, the way he did every evening, the way Nathan hoped he would for the rest of their lives. And Nathan kissed him back, tasting jade onion and certainty in the promise of all the tomorrows they would share together. Sometimes the most frightening dares led to the most beautiful discoveries. Sometimes the person you were meant to love had been right there all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to see them clearly. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that person was brave enough to see you too.